Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason, your guide to Spanish. Now in today's lesson, I'm going to be showing you how to formulate some of the most common kinds of if-then or conditional statements in Spanish, a topic many of you have been asking me about over the years and I'm just now getting to. Surprisingly, it's not that complicated, assuming you have a pretty good command of some of the verb tenses and moods we're going to be discussing. At least I'm going to try not to complicate it too much. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Empecemos. Alright, so as usual, and just to give you an idea about what to expect, here's an overview of today's lesson. We'll start off by talking about the basic structure that governs all if-then statements in Spanish. Then I'll introduce 4 of the most common types of if-then statements in Spanish. Finally, we'll talk about how to determine which verb tense to use in each of the clauses in if-then statements, and we'll provide a lot of examples in this third section of the lesson. And finally, we're going to finish up with a few exercises. So on this slide we see 2 examples of simple if-then statements in English and in Spanish. And you can see that if-then statements involve 2 clauses, a dependent or subordinate clause and a main clause. The dependent clause begins with the subordinating conjunction if, or si in Espanol, and it expresses certain conditions. So if it rains a lot, si llueve mucho, that's our dependent clause, those are the conditions. The main clause expresses the implications or consequences of the condition. So in this case, right, then certain areas flood, or ciertas áreas se inundan. Okay? So the main clause expresses what happens, what would happen, or what would have happened if these conditions were to occur, or had occurred. Another thing to point out about if-then statements, both in English and Spanish, is that the word that introduces the main clause, in this case, then, if it rains a lot, then certain areas flood, or its Spanish equivalent, something such as entonces, right? Si llueve mucho, entonces ciertas áreas se inundan. That word is often left out and not explicitly stated when forming if-then statements. In fact, most of the time I would say it is left out in both languages, so it's more common, if it rains a lot, certain areas flood, to leave out that word that introduces the main clause. Another important thing to point out about the structure of if-then statements in both languages is that you can flip the order of the clauses. In other words, the if clause can be put at the end of the sentence. So instead of saying, if it rains a lot, certain areas flood, I can put that main clause first. Certain areas flood if it rains a lot. You can do the same in Spanish. Ciertas áreas se inundan si llueve mucho. So the if clause can come first or at the end. And then one final thing to point out that should be obvious is that, of course, you can form if-then constructions as negative statements or even as questions. Okay, now moving on to the next section of the lesson, I want to introduce the 4 main kinds of if clauses. These are those that express conditions that are, first, general or abstract. So if you're just explaining things in the abstract, general conditions, universal truths, right? So if it rains a lot, certain areas flood. You can also have if statements that introduce conditions as imminent or likely to occur. Think of like at least a 50-50 chance, right? If it rains tomorrow, we'll cancel the excursion. A third kind, and slightly more complicated, are if clauses that introduce hypothetical conditions, but in the present tense or an undefined kind of time frame. If my house flooded, or it's hard to hear that subjunctive mood in English. If my house were to flood, hypothetically, if my house were to flood, I would stay with my sister. And then a fourth kind is similar to number 3, but it has to do with contrary to fact conditions in the past, right? Things that didn't happen. If my house had flooded, but it didn't, I would have stayed with my sister. So we'll be looking at, in this section, at examples involving each of those 4 kinds of if statements. So as you can see from those examples on the previous slide in English, right, using different kinds of if-then statements involves combining various verb tenses and moods in both the dependent or if clause and in the then or main clause. So the obvious difficulty, and probably the reason you're watching this lesson, is determining which tense to use in various kinds of if-then statements. The key, I think, is understanding that the kind of condition expressed in the dependent or if clause determines the tense and the mood. Again, tense we're talking about present, past, future. Mood, we're talking about subjunctive indicative. So that if clause determines the tense and mood of the verb in the main clause. Okay, but that probably sounds pretty abstract. So what we're going to do is look at some examples of each of the 4 kinds of if clauses I just introduced, and I'll point out what verb tenses and moods should be used as we go along. Okay, so let's talk about our first category of conditions or if statements, those that describe general or abstract conditions. In these kinds of if-then statements, we're talking about things in the abstract, describing or explaining general conditions and consequences. So we're not referring to any specific time frame or persons. That's important. Let me repeat that. We are not referring to any specific time frame or persons. So in these cases, the verbs in both the if clauses and the then clause are in the present tense and the indicative mood, as you can see from the examples on this slide. So again, our old favorite, if it rains a lot, certain areas flood. Si llueve mucho, ciertas áreas se inundan. Or put it backward, ciertas áreas se inundan si llueve mucho. Or another general, right, if-then statement. Nothing specific about time, place, or persons involved. Si los bancos realizan malas inversiones, pierden dinero. Or, flip the clauses, los bancos pierden dinero si realizan malas inversiones. Continuing on with the general or abstract conditions or if clauses. 3 more examples of this general mode, right? The first category. Plants die if they don't get enough water and sunlight. Las plantas mueren si no reciben suficiente agua y luz solar. So our verbs are in the present indicative. Si no reciben suficiente agua y luz solar, las plantas mueren. Students get better grades if they study a lot. Just a general principle expressed as an if-then statement. Not referring to your students, my students, those students. Los estudiantes sacan mejores notas si estudian mucho. Si los estudiantes estudian mucho, sacan mejores notas. Or phrased as a question, right? What happens if people don't obey laws? Just kind of a philosophical, universal kind of question. ¿Qué ocurre si las personas no obedecen las leyes? All right, let's move on to the second kind or second category of conditions or if statements. These are the imminent or likely conditions. So in these kinds of if-then statements, which are probably the most commonly used, we're talking about conditions as if they're imminent or likely to occur, like at least a 50-50 chance, usually sometime soon. So we're talking about a fairly specific future time frame, and the conditions and consequences apply to definite or specific persons or circumstances. So these are not universal, general, abstract. No, these are specific people, specific circumstances that are going to maybe happen sometime soon. So in these cases, which some people call predictive conditionals, the if clause is usually in the present tense indicative mood, si llueve mañana, and the then clause somehow refers to the future, although command or imperative forms are also possible. Now I say somehow refers to the future because Spanish has 3 very common ways of referring to the future. You can use the future tense, you can use the periphrastic future, like vamos a cancelar, where we take the verb ir and add an infinitive, or you can just use, right, the present tense, but from context it's clear you're referring to the future, like our third example. Okay, so you can use these 3 forms to refer to the future in Spanish. The point is, main clause, or excuse me, dependent or if clause verb is in the present indicative, and then the main clause somehow refers to the future or a command. Let's look at this example. If it rains tomorrow, we'll cancel the excursion. An imminent condition. Si llueve mañana, cancelaremos la excursión. That's future tense. Si llueve mañana, vamos a cancelar la excursión. That's that periphrastic future. Probably less common in this kind of construction. And then very common is the third option, right? Using the present to refer to the future. Si llueve mañana, cancelamos la excursión. Okay? And then finally, in these imminent or likely if clauses, it's perfectly fine to follow them up with a command or imperative form. The fourth one here is in the usted person, I guess you could say. Si llueve mañana, cancele la excursión. If it rains tomorrow, cancel the excursion. Here's some more examples, or another example of the imminent likely condition if clauses, right? You'll see the same pattern. If you arrive early, we'll have breakfast together. So we're talking about a definite, specific occurrence. Si llegas temprano, desayunaremos juntos. That's the future tense, the future form. Si llegas temprano, vamos a desayunar juntos. That second one to me doesn't sound as common. Si llegas temprano, desayunamos juntos. That third one is great, very, very common, very idiomatic, right? Using the present tense, desayunamos juntos, but clearly referring to like tomorrow morning. And then finally, an imperative. If you arrive early tomorrow, let's have breakfast together. Si llegas temprano, desayunemos juntos. And just two more examples of this imminent likely conditions or if clauses, because like I said, it is the most common kind of if-then clause in Spanish, I think. So just to drive home the point a little bit. If you break that toy, you're going to pay for it, right? So it's a specific toy, specific circumstance, right? Si rompes ese juguete, lo vas a pagar. Or, si rompes ese juguete, lo pagas. Present tense to refer to the future. If he calls, I'll talk to him. Si él llama, hablaré con él. Si él llama, hablo con él. Or, command form, si él llama, dile que no estoy. Tell him I'm not here. So, again, in these imminent or likely if clauses, what can follow in the main clause is either some reference to the near future usually, or a command, an imperative form. So let's move on to our third kind of if clause or conditional clause, the hypothetical conditions, right? If certain conditions were true, right, what would happen? These kinds of if-then statements are also fairly common in Spanish. We use hypothetical if-then statements, sometimes called counterfactual or contrary to fact if-then statements, to talk about what the consequences would be if certain hypothetical conditions were true. In a sense, the time frame is present, but we're speaking completely hypothetically. So an example here. Well, let's see. In these cases, the verb in the if clause, I should point out, the verb in the if clause is formed in the imperfect or past subjunctive, while the verb in the then clause is usually formed in the conditional. So, a couple of examples on this slide. If my house flooded, or were to flood, I would stay with my sister. Si mi casa se inundara, me quedaría con mi hermana. So you can see that form, se inundara, imperfect subjunctive. You might also hear se inundase, and then the conditional, me quedaría con mi hermana. If I won the lottery, I'd buy a house in Italy. Si yo ganara la lotería, compraría una casa en Italia. So again, the pattern is if clause, imperfect subjunctive, then clause, conditional. Let's look at a couple more examples of these hypothetical if clauses, right? And the then clauses that flow from them. If she were president, she isn't, but if she were, she would change several laws. Si ella fuera presidente, again, that's that imperfect subjunctive form. Si ella fuera presidenta, cambiaría varias leyes. Si fuera presidenta, cambiaría varias leyes. They'd visit, they would visit, they'd visit their friends if they had more time, but they don't. Visitarían a sus amigos si tuvieran más tiempo. So what you can see, what I did here was I flipped the main and the dependent clause. The if clause came at the end. Visitarían a sus amigos si tuvieran más tiempo. So the if clause has the imperfect subjunctive. Okay, and finally, moving on to the fourth category of if-then statements or if clauses, what I'm calling contrary to fact in the past. These kinds of if-then statements are a bit more complex. They refer to consequences that would have happened in the past if certain conditions had been met in the past. So the time frame being referenced is the past, but we're talking about conditions that were never met and consequences that never actually materialized. So it's a completely counterfactual scenario in the past. In these cases, the verb in the if clause, as you can see from the slide, is formed in the pluperfect subjunctive, while the verb in the then clause is formed in the conditional past, both of which are compound verb tenses involving forms of the auxiliary verb haber. So, a couple of examples on this slide illustrate everything I just said. It was quite a mouthful. If my house had flooded, I would have stayed with my sister. Si mi casa se hubiera inundado, or se hubiese inundado, me habría quedado con mi hermana. If I had won the lottery, but I didn't, if I had won the lottery, I would have bought a house in Italy. I would have bought a house in Italy. Si yo hubiera ganado la lotería, habría comprado una casa en Italia. And let's look at a couple more examples of this fourth, more complicated category, right? If she had been president, again, not if she were president, but if she had been president, completely counterfactual in the past. If she had been president, she would have changed several laws, but she didn't because she never was president, right? Si ella hubiera sido presidenta, or hubiese sido presidenta, habría cambiado varias leyes. They would have visited their friends, but they didn't. If they had had more time, habrían visitado sus amigos si hubieran tenido más tiempo. Again, I have flipped the order of the if-then clauses, right? I could also say, si hubieran tenido más tiempo, habrían visitado a sus amigos. So again, what we have here is the pluperfect subjunctive in the if clause, si ella hubiera sido presidente, and then the conditional perfect would have changed, habría cambiado varias leyes. All right, now just to see if you're getting the hang of this, I'm going to give you the chance to formulate a few if-then statements in Spanish on your own. What I'm going to do is put a few sentences or statements in English on the next slide. Once you see the slide, go ahead and pause it while you try to work out, either in your mind or on paper, how you'd express those same statements in Spanish. Then when you're ready to see my versions, my solutions, if you will, go ahead and hit play again. All right? You ready? Okay, so here's the first slide of the exercises. Go ahead and pause it now while you work out in your mind or on paper how you'd express these ideas. And of course, when you're ready to see my version of the answers, just hit play. Okay, so these are my versions of the answers, and answers may vary a little bit, but the important thing, because maybe you have all the vocabulary you need, maybe you don't, maybe you use different words, different verbs, the important thing is that you're close and that your verbs are in the same tense and mood. So, people lose weight if they eat less. That's a category 1, general, abstract. Las personas bajan de peso si comen menos. If you come to Houston, we'll go to a basketball game. Category 2, it's an imminent or likely. Si vienes a Houston, iremos, o vamos a ir, o vamos a un partido de básquetbol. Number 3 is also an imminent, but I'm using an imperative or command form. Let me know if she calls. Avísame o dime si ella llama. Si ella llama, avísame o dime. Number 4, if they spoke Spanish, in the sense of if they were to speak Spanish, if they knew Spanish, right, they would have more fun. Si ellos hablaran, imperfect subjunctive, si ellos hablaran español, se divertirían más. Divertirían más. And then finally, number 5 is one of those category 4, right? Contrary to fact in the past scenarios. If we had studied, we would not have, negative, right? We would not have failed the exam using the verb reprobar. Si nosotros hubiéramos estudiado, no habríamos reprobado el examen. Okay, so how'd you do? Well, I guess that's probably a silly question. I'm sure you got them all right. But let's try one more set of statements before we call it a day, okay? You ready? All right, here we go. All right, you know the drill already. Go ahead and pause on this slide while you form the if-then statements either on paper or in your mind, and then hit play when you're ready to see my version of the answers. Okay, once again, this isn't a real quiz, no points at stake, but what's important, and your answers may vary in terms of the vocabulary and even the verbs you choose, but what's important is that you're right on the verb tense and verb mood. Present, past, future, subjunctive, indicative. So general kind of universal truth, plants die if it doesn't rain enough, right? An abstract category 1, las plantas mueren si no llueve lo suficiente. Number 2 is an imminent or likely scenario. If we study together, we'll pass the exam. Si estudiamos juntos, present indicative, aprobaremos el examen, future tense. Aprobamos o vamos a aprobar would also be acceptable. Number 3, if you want advice, consejos, talk to a friend, right? So I have 2 versions here. First one in the familiar to form. Si quieres consejos, habla con un amigo, imperative. Or, si quiere consejos usted, hable con un amigo. Number 4, if you bought that house, in the sense of being subjunctive, hypothetical, if you were to buy that house, you would have to fix the roof. Si compraras esa casa, o si comprases esa casa, tendrías que arreglar el techo. The first if clause is hypothetical, kind of a third category scenario. We use the imperfect subjunctive and then the conditional. Number 5 is a category 4. Sounds like we're talking about hurricanes or tropical storms. Number 5 is category 4. It's one of those contrary to fact scenarios in the past. We would have traveled to New York, Nueva York, if our team had won, but it didn't, so we didn't. Habríamos viajado a Nueva York si nuestro equipo hubiera ganado. Alright, that's it for my presentation on if-then statements in Spanish. Hope you found it to be clear, informative, and useful. If so, do me a favor, share it with others. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, okay? Thanks a lot for watching. Remember to subscribe to my channel and follow me on all your social media platforms to receive regular updates and new content. Muchas gracias y hasta la próxima. Ciao.